Mediopolis, Chapter 17. Show Rambles. The elderly man had been researching more on mountain religions because he had a great interest for mountains, having lived there long, long ago. And he'd known many mountainous people too, from that long ago time. And inspired by the presentations of the visiting theologian students, and also expecting the theologian professor who might come to stay at the family show, under the mother's family roof at some point in the next few weeks. He was feeling there was so much more that was missing from his own studies that he still had yet to learn, and that he wanted to study more on. Yet feeling there was so much more missing from his own chapters of the nature religions. Yes, he'd gotten more curious about different theological studies in general, but he knew nothing of the actual nature-based religions. His studies, because of the alienology that he'd been into more recently, had focused on the star religions, moon religions, and the sun religions, religions from outer space religions. He hadn't really focused on earthling religions in any great depth or any detail. Not really. So he felt there were many missing chapters in his studies and his understanding of nature religions. He still had the river religions to much further study. They were said to have perhaps come from the mountain earlier religions. Perhaps. Who knew? Both the mountain religions and the river religions seemed so old-fashioned, from an archaic, long-gone age, that it was hard to say, too long ago, whichever one came first. Perhaps they evolved together. Although he was not sure yet, he still had, after a long time spent with the student grandsons, the animistry friends, he had been prescribed some animal names from them, and had been much more studying the animology of the animal students. In fact, he'd gone to see a so-called animal doctor that the animal students had taken him to, out of interest, an animal doctor of animism, or animisticism. There were various different names for it. A bit like history. It was called animistry, and that's what they said was a history told from the perspective of the animals themselves, rather than from a human perspective. But it wasn't just a history of the animals. There was also a psychology of animal belief, a psychology of animal energies. There was an intense, close study, not just of the animals' behaviours, but also a study of what beliefs they might have too, based on what their behaviours might be and what their different abilities were. This so-called animal doctor of animology or animism, he felt maybe had some truth to it, perhaps some grains of truth. He wasn't sure, perhaps if it was fanciful and exaggerated too much, perhaps, though. Still didn't know enough about it. He was also given some names that were supposed to be different animal names, supposedly that he had resembled in the way that he behaved somehow. His behaviour somehow, accordingly, had some similarity to whatever those other animal behaviours were. Though the animal doctor had only really seen him briefly, it was just a brief encounter, not really a long in-depth study. The animal doctor had confessed that himself. So whether we really did have these so-called animal spirits, or animal energies, as others in the group had called them, who knew? Maybe people did have specific animal abilities that were similar and related to specific other animals too. And maybe people had these combination of different animal energies that combined together. He was told about the secret animal that he might have, his present animal, and what the different animal natures that he might have according to different places and different circumstances. There was really a lot more in depth to it all. We'd only really had a few of his more common, more likely animal characteristics that were prescribed to him by the animal doctors, or by the so-called animal doctors. The mother had laughed at him when he told her all about it, going to the farm show with them, to see the farm doctors there. She'd never been prescribed anything of the sort, although she'd gone along herself just to supervise how they were getting on, to observe and see what it was about, but not to participate herself. Whereas the older man had gone a few steps further, and had at least tried to participate a little bit, even though he still had his doubts, quite what it was about, though. whether there were animal energies or animal abilities, whatever they were, that people could inherit or enhance or adapt to. Whether they were these or not, he didn't find any of the local animists, however, seemed to know that much about it themselves, where they referred him to a more general, the national groups and the international organizations of animism and animology, and told him that those wider groups, referring to sources online, all different groups, he'd never known that there were so many of them, that they would know much more, the local animology group assured him. Perhaps there was some combination of the abilities, mixed also with human abilities too, not instead, they'd said. If there were really any similarities so close between his particular behaviours and particular animals, he resolved to perhaps research that much more, realising that he'd have a lot more studies to do before he could come to any firm conclusions. So that at the next debates with the animal students, that he'd have much more knowledge then of those under investigations in their beliefs. He would then go to the debates armed with that knowledge, perhaps, if he learnt enough. There were so many of them there, and there were so many terms and other conditions he didn't understand yet, though. And so varied, of course. No one was an expert in all of them. That's what the locals claimed, even those that had studied it well. So how could he know much about how credible any of it could be yet, as a mere outsider, with only dipping his foot in the water a little, wading in perhaps at most, hardly swimming in the depths, or going out far to sea, though. Still, he was still considering such things in his initial studies. There were so many of these other things to study as well, though. No one could know all of them, so it took time to gradually study each one. There were so many and they were so varied. Of course, no one was an expert in all of them. One could know a little about a lot, or perhaps a lot about a little of them, but perhaps not be an expert in all of them, or not even a majority, not even half, perhaps. No one could be. It was well enough to know that they all existed, but not to actually know that much about some of them, certainly not to be an expert in a large amount of them. Perhaps all still existed, yet finding out how they related also to each other, as well as to him and to the world as well. Well, that in fact could take a lot of time and practice and energy and devotion, could be a challenge for any man to commit to. No matter the commitment, it was so much to commit to. One's devotions to it were not surely enough, as each man had his restraints in both time and energy, and also in his abilities also, that could also change in time. There was also therefore the desire to know as well, how much one was prepared to push oneself, how much one wanted to know and was fascinated by these things, how much one saw a need to know in these things, would also be a driving factor. There was the natural bias as well to overcome in these studies that he'd been taught by the psychology students years ago, but he often forgot those lessons too, so it was good to refresh them. Those biases that we all inherited from our own particular perspectives, from the own limited experiences that we'd have within our own life. That natural bias that had to be overcome somehow, so that it could be more objective, rather than his own subjective thoughts without any reason or rationality. All in all, the sociological projects had a tendency to study one or even just a few of the things and the behaviours that were only familiar to the actual studier themselves. We tend to study things that are much more familiar and more comfortable, more known to us. There was also a bias to not to study alien things, things that were foreign, exotic, unknown, things that were outside of our realm of knowledge. Not totally outside, but much more than the things that we are familiar with. Perhaps foreign religions, foreign foods, foreign people, foreign ideas, foreign sciences, foreign planets even. All types of exotic, unknown, unpronounceable, foreign things, just outside our realm of knowledge, because there was a great unknowing about it, whether it's unknown ideas, or unknown people, or unknown places. Unless, of course, we can research and get to know them sometimes first, or even unknown customs and regulations, perhaps. It is hard to judge those things as well in an impartial way, without imposing our own, more known values and our own personal belief system onto other things we don't yet know. Our own political beliefs, our own philosophical beliefs, our own religious beliefs, our own familiar beliefs, our own social beliefs as well, our own psychological understandings, that we don't impose those things on other things that we don't yet understand. If we're only looking at foreign ideas through our own familiar lens, though, through our own familiar ideas, framing them, then it could distort those very ideas that we're trying to see afresh and new. Framing the ideas, it is hard to frame them neutrally, yet necessary to have a consistent, methodical view that follows what one believes to be true, to be consistent with how we apply our beliefs. And to do so also in a very sensitive, considered way that is sensitive to the differences of others that may think differently than ourselves. And not just follow what alone we are familiar with, not just to follow our own knowledge, the only things that we know, or we can become stagnant and closed off, sealed off from new ideas potentially, from new religious, philosophical, political, social, economic ideas, from all number of different ideas, psychological ideas. We can be sealed off and cut off from people we don't know, customs we don't understand. That could very much enrich our lives as much as impoverish it, simply because it's unknown and strange and foreign and alien, means that it's not known, and it's hard then to decipher and to decide whether it is something that could be valuable or something that could even be harmful. Hard to know if it's something that could enrich our lives or impoverish it, perhaps, by understanding it. It could bring a sense of peace to our lives as much as conflict if it's something that we just don't know anything about. The fears of unknown worlds are often legitimate, yet also they are often not at all. Yet we cannot know without first getting to know them gradually. We cannot know without getting to know something, whether it will be good or not, whether it will be useful or not, whether it be something that could be beneficial to us or not at all, or how much. We couldn't know without first getting to know it, at least from an outsider's perspective. And one could not do that, the older man had realised after so long, without trying to be respectful and sincere and fair in judgment to new situations, to new people, to new concepts, to new situations and new places, and anything that is totally new, reserving judgment with an absence of evidence. We should be equally desiring, but also cautious, but yet still determined to seek out such new beliefs that could add and enrich our own, potentially. But we should also still be cautious. Only the alien truly fears humanity, but also only truly desires to know humanity better too. Young Stew, the theologian, not to be confused with Media Stew, who was studying media at the time, or Animal Stew, indeed, or even Social Stew, or all the other stews that were known to study different things, and many different things they did. Stew were all short for students. That's what they were called at the college campus. Outside of that, they weren't needed to be called that when they went out, because everyone there was a student. But to distinguish themselves from each other, they also called themselves by the various different combination of subjects that they would study. So Media Theo Stew studied theological media, for example. There was even an animal media theology stew. But there were so many multiple combinations, dozens and dozens with just a few subjects, and there were an infinite variety with dozens and dozens and dozens of subjects that could be combined in all manner and number of different ways. There were so many things that the different students had studied that they were always composing unique new subjects to study by combining the different subjects in all manner of different combinations of ways. The older man had discovered many of the stewards, who were also called stews for short sometimes, just for ease of use. He had discussed at length with some of them he'd met in the study houses a few of the media religions, because he was going on to study different theologies, and he'd studied many of the man-made theologies already, but he hadn't yet studied enough some of the media theologies themselves. There were the film religions, the book religions, and there were the online gaming religions too, the internet religions that had grown up and advanced over the years to spawn all number of new theologies he'd never heard of. Certainly never heard of the gaming theologies. The filming theologies, yes, of course, those have been around for a long time. And the book religions, the book theologies are a lot longer than them. Certainly went much further back in history, back to ancient history as they called it. But the film religions and film theologies went back as far as ancient history. Those were older too, and had spawned many other multiple different sectarian groups within the film theologies themselves. Many of those were also overlapping with film psychologies. Some of the film theologies were, in fact, film psychotheologies, as well as also being social theologies, as well as psychosocial theologies too. There were all manner of different combinations that he'd been discovering. Never heard of the online gaming theologies, though. No, those were new ones. The computer theologies had spawned all different kinds of new futuristic theologies, ones that he was only learning about himself still, and others in his society were still learning about too. Many of the new ideas bewildered the older man, and it was difficult for him to imagine what those would be. He'd never heard of the online virtual religions, the online virtual theologies, or psychologies, or online virtual worlds. He never really entered into much, and knew very little about still. Even so, he was much fascinated by them, and by this new emerging virtual world, this new man-made theocracy within their virtual world too. The virtual theologies, the virtual psychologies, and the virtual sociologies too, spawning ever new subjects that this new technology itself had given birth to. He knew of the theatrical religions and the book religions from the much earlier years, and the film religions that had come at a much different time, many, many years, and a totally different age. But the theatrical theologies were from a much earlier time, the ancient times, as it was now called. To clarify it, from the ancient time, the modern time, the present time, and the future time, and the near future time, of course, were quite different from the distant future time, the modern future time, and the ancient future time, not to be confused with the ancient future time. Very few people ever talked about that to the older man, though, and he never had much of a need to talk about those things, and the distant times either, really. Those things weren't studied that much anymore, only in small closed circles. Often they were small niche groups that only met occasionally with esoteric knowledge. It was a very niche study. But still, some of the ancient theologies and religions and sociologies and psychologies were still relevant and studied, because they were still practiced, and things that had evolved and changed dramatically in their natures. But still, their essence and fundamental nature had something still the same about it, even if its technology had totally transformed how it was communicated, where, why, and in what ways. It had transformed it dramatically. The singing and acting theologies and psychologies were nothing like the ancient histories, far from it. But still, they had some relations with them. The singing and acting theologies and the dramatic theologies too. They had many different conflicts, but also engagements and similarities with the more recent changes. Yet he knew little of the latest trends, of the interactive filming theologies, and even the so-called live streaming religions, the live streaming psychology shows, and the live streaming theology shows. He knew very little about those emerging live streaming religion shows, or the live streaming psychology shows. He'd heard about them and discussed them briefly, and read little articles, and watched a few short films and discussion shows about them, but not to great length, not to something to write about or talk about in depth with others. not for his in-depth study, certainly. It was hard really to grasp still many of those concepts, never mind really knowing if they were good or bad things for the individual or society, or whether some combinations of them could be good or bad, or be useful in application and have some benefit and purpose, or just be a waste of time and fanciful and fictional and just for fun or very little use and frivolous. He had very little way of knowing such things without much knowledge of it yet. What he could teach, what he could teach them was about his own parents' beliefs and his own, those things that were his familiar beliefs that he did know well, those that he was brought up with, that he could still remember well and still rediscover well. All of the mountain theocracies and the mountain religions, all those that he'd talked about at great length, debated in conversations back long ago in the family house. Of the mother, he remembered her well, saying about her own children, who had left long ago, they had left their mountain beliefs behind long ago, in favour of the more enticing, the more closer and the faster to the eye and to the hand. They followed the animal beliefs that were much more faster, changed much quicker than ever the mountain beliefs would themselves, that seemed so stubborn, enduring, indomitable, and unchanging. The animal theocracies and the animal belief systems had much more of an appeal, of course they did, as well as the human beliefs too, because they both changed and moved so dramatically, sometimes quickly, sometimes faster, sometimes very slow, sometimes very quick, but always fast compared to mountains. And compared to trees too, even compared to the plant theocracies and tree theologies, they were still the animals, however slow some were much faster than all the plant theologies. Both the human and the animal beliefs and theologies were much more faster in their evolutions than the mountain theologies, and also even the tree and plant theologies too. Confronting the animologist students, the elder man had accused one of them of abandoning the mountain beliefs that they had been part of in their much earlier part of life, that had been the earlier origin, he claimed, perhaps, of the early nature theologies. For a faster way of life, they'd abandon it all, the elder man had said, nonchalantly, upset with them almost. And the student, though, had admitted that the mountains didn't really seem to change that much for vastly long periods of time, for aeons, for ages. They seemed to remain the same, much like when you looked at them. Like when you looked at vegetables growing, just to stare at them, you never really saw them change or move or grow. They even made the vegetable religions, however, look like they were fast growers, and they never seemed to move at all. But compared to the mountains, they did seem to change fast, perhaps. Or even the flower theologies, the religion of flowers. Well, at least you get to see some significant changes in those during the course of your lifetime. Yes, even in a season, in a year, they change dramatically. They grow and wilt away in just a year. But many lifetimes can pass on, generations can flow by, and still the same mountain can appear so similar after centuries that could pass by. Even in the tree theologies that had changed gradually over many, many centuries. Yet the mountain theologies just seemed immovable over great vaster periods of time, fixed in the same positions, apart from the very small occasional avalanches here or there that sometimes happened, where there would be a small alteration of dramatic effect occasionally. But they often seemed, for great vast expanses of time, to offer no real change, just the same picture endlessly, that never really altered, that seemed to be so similar, at least, to so many visitors from so many different centuries. Like they were caught in some ancient traditions that could never really seem to change much. Millenniums passed by with no significant changes to the actual structures, to the foundations of the mountains. Millenniums may pass by. That may happen. What were the odds of anything really dramatically happening that would change the mountain theologies during the lifetime of a single person. It was very unlikely that something such dramatically as an earthquake would happen, that would somehow dramatically alter the mountain's theology and its dramatic changes that could be perceived within a lifetime. Those things did happen, yes, but they were extremely rare. And many, many generations might pass by, dozens of centuries, and many more besides, without any real significant change to any of the mountains themselves, nor the mountain theologies themselves. In defence of his beloved mountains, although he'd never really seen them for such a vast long time, and hadn't had the chance to visit them, but the elder man had said, when the mountains move, they make more changes than all the animals, peoples, trees, and the vegetables all put together. That the new births and deaths of mountains, as well as their recreations, had more transformational change, although they were much rarer. They were monumental and more profound in their changes when they did rarely happen. Their ancient changes, as well as their possible future changes too, should therefore be something that we all would want to study and get to know the consequences of much more, both personally and the individual changes that could affect, as well as the social changes too, for whole cities, towns, continents, nations. Mountains are very often remote from people, except for the minority of mountain dwellers, those that live nearby within the mountain sphere, or on their steeps, the hills of the mountains. Visitors often have to make a long journey, often a long pilgrimage to meet the mountains, or to meet the mountain people too. So it's no wonder most people, even the majority, have never really had a chance to visit the mountains that much. And even those that have made a journey, or been able to make a handful of visits even, only know really a few of the mountain peaks, just a few of the mountains, that may not really represent all of the many other mountain ranges, the vast amount of other mountain ranges there are. So we are not really directly taught by the mountains, or at them, not to the extent that we are taught by flowers, or trees, or animals, or people even. That we are all, to varying extents, more familiar with all of those things. Mountains are much more remote and distant and harder to get to. Many of the mountains, if not perhaps all of them, to all people. Of course, there are many exceptions to the rule. Those that have spent many years, perhaps months or years, or even many decades, living in more familiar areas with the mountains, living close with the mountain people, animals, trees, and flowers, and the mountain wildlife in general. There are those that have spent lifetimes working, living, playing, dreaming within the mountains themselves. And there are many legends and myths and stories of the mountain people, of the mountain animals and mountain trees and mountain flowers, and all the mountain theologies and psychologies and sociologies that came from all of those, who have lived and studied high up in the mountain lands for long periods of time, those that know intimately, but only maybe their particular special mountains that they lived and studied and knew and worked within. Because mountains rise up when plate tectonics move underneath in the deep bowels within the earth and force the land up against one another, and that between the mountains are often the different holes and the cracks, the caverns, the tunnels, the caves, and all the different gaps that open up. There is then all the different links and the chasms down into the underworld, the deeper depths down inside the inner world of the earth itself, deep down within it. And there are deep down there many different legends and myths and stories of people that have explored deep under and within the mountains. Many mountain explorations deep within, buried within the mountain ranges themselves. And perhaps past avalanches or quakes that could have happened could have even created and sealed up entrances to under-mountain caverns that may have been and had long ago mountain paths that may have travelled deeper under the mountains. that may have been more inaccessible in later times, that other people may not have been able to pass deeper within, under the mountains, to study within them. So perhaps it wasn't as possible to study under and within so much as around the mountains as it was in ancient times, if ancient mountain paths are not so accessible. But it was hard to know what ancient mountain paths there may have been. Some mountains are rich also in different mineral deposits deep within their bowels, deep within the earth, within its ground. Different metals and minerals and different nutrients that can be found deep within its deposits. Yet it's also hard to navigate and to travel through any mountain range with sufficient resources. You can't just dig up a mountain in the way that you could dig up within a desert. It's not that easy. Or with more effort, even a forest would be much easier than to dig up a whole mountain. Neither can you just weave between all its steep slopes and over the rough, ragged, rocky terrains quite so easily either, depending on the mountain terrain itself. Nor can you enjoy necessarily moderate weather conditions in all of the mountainous regions. It's not like weaving a path between trees in a nice, warm, conditioned forest or trees. There are often wide open spaces exposed to the elements, where it is very cold, windy, and wet, where storms can be exposed to, and any people or animals that are also out there, the mountain dwellers, one could be exposed to, off on the mountain journeys, where one is exposed to a vast amount of elements and potentially mountain people and mountain animals too. Great achievements of modern man, revisiting so many of the mountain peaks, continued with some mountains having steady flows of many visitors being able to travel there, albeit very brief visits, seasons allowing. But many other mountains have been more than visited, where people and animals lived with the mountains. In many peaks for short stays, and in a few peaks for very long stays people were able to visit. Many of the mountain dwellers left behind the mountain long, long ago, though, and have slowly been moving away from the mountain in greater numbers over many years in many of the mountains. Those that had remained often had their children leave, only to visit them occasionally, or perhaps never to again return. Not be able to, perhaps. Many more are the mountain peaks that are still never visited, or only visited very briefly or very occasionally, and those unexplored, unlived in mountain peaks that still remained, a great many, a mystery today. Perhaps they're hiding no great secrets, no great mysteries, or perhaps some of them have buried within them great things to use, to learn, to see, and to teach us. There are many good reasons why few or no one may visit many of those mountain peaks, of course. They are uninviting often, though not all, but many mountain peaks can be uninviting. Often they can be inhospitable, seemingly barren, many of them. Barren of much life, perhaps, of tree life, wildlife, animal life, and food life. Many are quite barren and lifeless, others are quite remote and difficult to get to, or that they were just prone sometimes to avalanches, difficult to climb, or too steep to climb, perhaps. Or they were too exposed to the elements, in too colder climates, perhaps, or too exposed also to the sun, or to the winds and the storms and the rains as well. Perhaps some of them also have ice caps that melt and also have avalanches of ice. And there are also the river waters too, that can make some of the river mountains difficult to pass through in wet season, making mountain passage slippery and difficult, treacherous even. The lack of the earth, vegetation, and of other animals in many of the mountain peaks, and the lack of people that are able to live there for longer periods of time, is also another major factor that will put many people off being able to visit so many of those mountain peaks. So, of course, a great majority of the mountain peaks are either never visited or only ever rarely, and perhaps never studied in great depth or detail. Of course, like people, the mountains are incredibly varied in temperaments and in their habitats, and also in their abilities to change and how they change. So we should never be prejudicial and think that all mountains are just the same, just because they happen to share the same name, when their sizes, their histories, their relationships to people, to animals, to vegetation, to the elements can all vary so greatly and to change so much, some of them too. All mountains may have a right to exist and to have their own purpose that they may have, however much unknown those may be to people, to animals, to others too. Yet they are all different from each other, all unique, however much some may have different family mountains that relate to each other much more, like the Rocky Mountains, Desert Mountains, Ice Mountains, River Mountains, and so on. But with the different abilities to affect others for better or worse, we should consider the different benefits and the risks that different mountains could provide, different mountain visitors also, as well as the connections to the underworld that the mountains do have, because they are also so high up and raised above ground level, above cloud level in some places. They also have that connection to the world above too, whether one calls it sky or the heavens or just calls it outer space or the above world. It has a connection, a mountain, both to the world below and to above as well. The mountains are told by many to have a connection, therefore, to both the world below and the world above. There are many stories, legends, and myths of the humans either visiting the underworlds below the mountains, or the worlds above, or having some connection and some communion with either the world above or the world below, or even from both. And there are many claims of finding allegedly many different artifacts that could, of course, come from a world fallen below the mountain that could have been collapsed during an avalanche at some point, perhaps retrieved through some expeditions into the deeper caverns. There are many stories of those people receiving messages or visions, perhaps from the heavens above, or perhaps from wherever, from those mountain visits and the mountain journeys. Skeptics would say that many of the claims could be wild imaginations, or even perhaps hallucinations, auditory or visual hallucinations in the form of mirages, perhaps. Perhaps those could be caused by the effect of the ramblers and the climbers being alone for so long, or it being altered heights of elevation. Those altered heights of elevation, without a lot of concrete evidence, without knowing, those are subjective accounts. They could be purely speculative or imaginative or hallucinatory. It's hard to know because they are not real evidence that is caught on film that shows clear, absolute evidence of what those people claim to experience of them. Perhaps it's not always possible to capture on evidence all such things, though. Who knows, thought the older man. Perhaps they are just stories, but remain debatable and unknown, except perhaps to the mountaineers who'd experienced it themselves. And even they may not know fully themselves what really had happened and what really that phenomenon they had experienced was. Was there any other way to relearn or to remember the teachings of the mountains other than actually pilgrimaging and visiting and experiencing one there oneself? Had wondered the older man, looking through his mountaineering theology notes now to try and make some more notes for the talk he'd be doing with the theological professor that would be visiting, old Theo, did he hope to catch up with at some point. He was wondering, perhaps, because he'd visited the mountains so long ago and still had a great love and lure of them, if he could perhaps one day return to revisit some of the old mountain friends. But they were his friends or foes from long, long ago, and did he really know them that well any more now? That did depend upon the mountain in particular. Like with people, he was really estranged from many of them too. But so many of the mountain friends that he was estranged from, he just wasn't sure about because he hadn't seen or known them for so long now. So he felt maybe many of the mountains could be potential teachers or give him some kind of guide to get to know things much more. Yet they equally could have nothing really to teach him, or no mountain teacher he could easily reach. He was really quite uncertain, and of course there could be risks and lots of costs in going, so he would need to justify the risks of doing that, and also the costs too. He could easily reach some of the mountains, but the ones he really wanted to go to involved a greater amount of risk and also cost and a lot of effort and time that it would take to do that too. To justify such research, he was still considering it. Whether it was possible to see a mountain teacher or not, he wasn't sure. Maybe he could talk to them distantly. With some of the older mountain teachers, they had either been very familiar with, or people he was familiar with. They knew the mountain teachers well enough, and maybe could introduce him. Maybe he could talk to them remotely. The mountain is not your friend, yet neither does he have to be your foe either. The older man had been told that by a mountain teacher long ago, had heard one of the mountaineers say it when he was visiting a mountain long ago. He'd listened to that and had been told he must approach the great mountain with great respect, with humility, and adapt his journey according to the mountain's conditions, not just his own or his own group's conditions and their desires and wishes and what they wanted to look like and dress like and when they wanted to eat and all those sort of things and how much they wanted to carry and where they wanted to camp out. They would have to transform everything and consider everything according to the mountain's needs. There were also the issues, and many other issues for him to consider about the mountain's conditions itself. Yet neither could he really think to revere the mountain itself too much. No, it was not a mountain god, nor was it a mountain angel or mountain demon, nothing to confuse with in any that way. It had its limited time and place and its special purpose. The mountain had no respect to give those who bowed down before it, of course. They neither accepted demonizing insults nor worship of them. Indifferent to any thoughts of men were those mountains. Yet in some mountains it was still possible for some animals and human students to visit and to learn from the mountains and to learn a way of life and to learn things from the mountain itself. Often with lots of humility, as well as an endurance of strength, those mountaineers had lots to teach us, about both courage and caution too, that were needed when visiting many of the mountain teachers, and the mountains themselves. Having studied many of the religions of men, the elder had known that many of them had some connection in their earlier origins to the mountains. Not all, but some of them certainly had a strong connection to mountains themselves, and perhaps to the mountain theologies. Whether they were just legends or myths, perhaps, or actual factual accounts, however exaggerated, that did have some grains of truth in them. He still wasn't quite sure. The religions of men also came from the deserts as well as the forests and the oceans, but not just the mountains, though the mountains in some of the mountain theologies did play a special, particular role, in many of them in fact, although less of them still existed now, or were thriving that well perhaps. So the mountains only really played a small role in some of the greater religious stories really today. But still, they were there in the ancient stories, and significant stories they still were to many people. And they were epics, and a significant amount of them. In many of the theologies, and many more stories, psychology stories, and sociology stories too, of a many different varying accounts, that did feature a variety of different mountains, and different mountainous characters that feature in so many different stories, all across the world really. Not just mountainous theology stories, but also, in general, mountain social stories of all different kinds. Many other human theologies have little to no connection with any mountains, perhaps evolving in their own flatlands or far away from any mountain lands. And the androcentric human religions, the human theologies, also often view the world through human eyes, seeing a man-made world like a human religion or a human science, perhaps. or the media religions, like the religious films or the psychology films or theology films, that tended to be by people, about people, and also for people. But contrasting with that, the nature-based theologies, with the theology films, the theology books, and all the other things, they were often by animal people, or by plant people, or mountainous people. Yes, they were for people, but they were often about not just people, but the plants and rivers and mountains, and also about the sun and the moon and stars and the natural world in general. There are many that have long since merged with the human theologies too, the nature theology sometimes merging with the human theology itself, when and if there was a compatible merging that could happen. Then there are the claims of those supernatural religions, as opposed and in contrast to the natural religions, the natural theologies of the nature mountains and the river mountains and all the others as well. The animal theologies, the river theologies, and the mountain theologies, and all the others. Also, that would talk of the supernatural theologies, those of God or gods, angels, demons, spirits, ghosts, supernatural aliens, and any other supernatural mysteries and supernatural phenomenons. Too many others to really name and to study or to fully know. Studying all of the many different theologies and religions, many that weren't even called that by some perhaps, or that weren't just known or classified and studied perhaps. There was such a broad number of different ones that had many different relations to each other too. One can learn about all the different human theologies from the many human teachers or preachers or theologians of what their different beliefs are. And there are a lot of different views about how, why, where, and when these humans started living with those beliefs and why they developed those beliefs. Studying all the different beliefs of the animals, one must observe what those behaviors are, what their sounds are, in order to try and predict what their actual beliefs might be. Or one can still communicate in limited ways. With much patience, it is possible. And in fact, it is possible to learn some things about some of the animal beliefs that they may have. Yet they may not be the same, of course, as human beliefs, and one would study them in quite a different way. They may tell people, the animals, what they value or not based on their behaviour, yet not in words or books or films, of course, and not through their work so much. But just through their work and play, they do communicate. Their songs and their dances tell about how they believe and what they know, if one can call it that, animals performing for people. As for the religions of gods or other supernatural beings, or the religions of God, or the religion of gods, or the religion of gods, only God or the gods would really know, tried to reason the older man, except that which is revealed to man by God or the gods. Yet if only God or the gods know God or gods fully, then perhaps only they would know fully what their beliefs are, and only what's revealed would be known to that person. Then how does any man know if it does come from God if they don't fully know God? Through a human messenger, or through animal, tree, or mountain, or river messengers, perhaps. And even lots of people can only be speculating about what they think other people's beliefs about gods are. Only God could tell you what the religion of God truly was, perhaps, thought the older man. Only gods could tell you what gods really knew. And perhaps people could tell you only what people knew. And perhaps animals could tell you only what animals knew. This seemed quite reassuring and logical to the older man. Well, of course, it was possible for people to reveal different things to people. But then people made claims that God or gods could make and reveal different things to people. But it was hard to know about many different people's claims. You could only really know what had been revealed to yourself, fully and wholly, believed the older man. Then, of course, there were these strange supernatural beliefs about all the different ghosts and ghouls and angels and demons, and of course all the aliens as well, and all the other different things that he didn't even have names for. All the different alien theologies that there were besides, those he'd only really been studying during his alienology more recently, and knew still very little about those. That only an alien could tell you really what the religions of the aliens were. Well, that must be true logically too, reasoned the older man also, not really knowing if there were such thing as aliens, whether they also would have psychologies, theologies, religious beliefs, and what the nature of any of those would even be, except for wild speculation. Of course, it would be impossible to know without meeting any, or without knowing any of them.